let's go back and just mention those green algae. So this picture was in the back. It's also on the video that you can watch. This is what Volvox looks like. Remember we said it's a colony of plant cells, and these are like baby colonies that break out. These guys right here next to it is Spirogyra. And Spirogyra is a true multicellular organism made up of multiple cells with a spiral-shaped chloroplast. There's another Spirogyra right here. All right, then we talked about the brown algae, or kelp, and there's a kelp in the bottle. We actually dealt with this on page L5, and on the kelp, they have these air bladders. And the purpose of those, we learned, is to help them float because they weigh quite a bit. And that takes us to the mosses. And the mosses are on page L6. On L6, we began talking about the higher plants. And the first group are phylum Bryophyta, or the mosses. Now, there are 24,000 species of mosses, and I'm only going to hold you responsible for 7,000 of them. No, we put one moss out. So this is what the moss looks like. This is what you'll see kind of growing. These are really small plants. They only live in wet places. And you'll typically see them growing in the muddy shade area, maybe around the foundation of a house. I know with this right here, the way I project it, it doesn't show up very well, but you'll see them in here. But this looks different than lichens. So to compare this with the lichen is not, the moss is growing in soil, in dirt. The lichen is growing either on a piece of, a branch of a tree, or it's growing on a rock, but it's not just growing in dirt, usually. So make sure you know the difference between those. And that takes us to, on L6, the second phylum of plants that live on land. There are only 4 phylum we're asking you to know altogether in the plant kingdom, but this is the most important of all the phylum in the plant kingdom, and that's the Tracheophytes. The Tracheophytes are the vascular plants. And we learned last time that there are 2 types of vessels on page L9. On L9. Phloem down and xylem. Well, phloem. And one type of vessel carries sugars that are formed in the top part of the plant. So some vessels carry the sugars formed in the leaves down to the roots. Those are the phloem down vessels. And the xylem up carry water and minerals from the soil up through the roots up to the leaves of the plant. It's a little bit similar to arteries and veins in us. We will be learning later when we get to the animal kingdom that arteries carry blood in one direction in our body and the veins carry blood in the reverse direction in our body. So it's a similar parallel. We said that also in terms of vascular plants, the Tracheophytes, that there are male sex cells and female sex cells, and they have to be dispersed either in the water or the air. Usually, since they live on land, they have to be dispersed by air. And we'll talk about the challenge of that. Usually, the pollen, the male sex cells, are dispersed by either the wind or insects. And we'll talk more about that. So we're going to divide the phylum Tracheophyta, or vascular plants, into 3 classes. And let me just summarize those classes right now. All right, so on this chart, so here's phylum Tracheophyta, the vascular plants. We've mentioned there are 2 types of vessels, phloem down and xylem up. And the 3 classes are, class number 1, class Feliciniae, or you can just say ferns. And there's really just 2 things I'm going to ask you to know about ferns. Just 2 things. What a frond is and what sori are. And I'll explain that in just a moment, but let's look at the big picture here. Then we're going to talk about the second class, the second class of tracheophytes, or vascular plants, those are the class Gymnosperm, or conifers. They're on page L12. And there's only about 3 things we're going to ask you to know about them. We're going to talk about the needles, and male cones and female cones. And then the third class, and I'll project this more again in just a moment, is class Angiosperms. Those are the plants that have flowers. And we're going to divide them into 2 subclasses, monocot angiosperms and dicot angiosperms, and talk about 4 differences between them. Let me go through each of these, and I'll return back to this summary chart in just a moment. On page L9, so on L9, we mention the ferns on page L9. There are 10,000 species of ferns, and they range in size from 1 inch tall to 36 feet tall. And they have these large leaves called fronds. All right, so this is an example of a frond. Everybody is familiar with the leaves, fern leaves, right? So now, they're called fronds, and the only other thing that I really want you to know is that on the underside, the bottom side of the frond are these reproductive spore sacs called sori. And you have a picture of this on page L11. On L11, so here's a picture of a frond, a fern frond, and on the underside are these sori, or spore sacs. Now, some of us might be thinking, I don't know what he's talking about. Actually, I think all of you know what I'm referring to when I show you this. Many of you have looked at a fern, and you look at the underside, and you saw these things, and you said, my gosh, there's bugs. Has anybody ever seen that? Yeah. Those are not bugs. They may be brown or black spots. Those are the reproductive structures. And what is released from these spore sacs, or sori, are little microscopic spores, microscopic seeds that are then released into the soil, and that's how it reproduces. So next time you see a fern, and on the right, this is the top side, but on the underside it's got what looks to be bugs on it, now you know those aren't bugs. So again, the importance of science is that it helps us understand things the way the world works. All right, that's all that I wanted you to know about ferns. So, so much for that. That takes us to page L12. So on L12, the conifers, or class Gymnosperm. Now, the Gymnosperms, or conifers, and it gets the name conifer because they have cones. Conifer means to bear or have cones. So these are the cone-bearing trees and shrubs that are also characterized in most cases in having needle-shaped leaves. And they always have these needle-shaped leaves all year round. Unlike other kinds of trees that may drop all their leaves, like in the winter, these trees are said to be evergreen. They're always green because they may shed some of their needles, their needle-shaped leaves, but they never shed all of them. Now, everybody is certainly familiar with these trees that have these needle-shaped leaves. And so these include, as we wrote here, pine trees, spruce trees, cedar trees, fir trees, podocarpus, cypress, junipers, and redwoods, as well as cycads and ginkgos. But mostly we think of pine and spruce and cedar and fir. These are what you would call Christmas-type trees. All right, and they all have these needle-shaped leaves. This is a lot different than the leaves found in most other plants and trees. You know, most other plants have leaves that are kind of broad, like this, and not needle-shaped. So these have these needle-shaped leaves. And that makes them well adapted to live in places where it snows. Because when those plants and trees have these big broad leaves and it snows, it basically, the snow is too heavy and it breaks the leaves off. But in these needle-shaped leaves, they're very flexible, and therefore the snow, when it snows, it doesn't cause them to break off. So they're well adapted to live in places where it's very cold. That's usually where we think of pine trees and spruce trees and fir trees, is up at the high mountain elevations of mountains, or up in British Columbia or something like that, where it tends to get cold and there's snow. Now, something that you may not have known about the needle-shaped leaves is that they're always found in bundles called fascicles. In this picture, it shows, here's a bundle containing 2 needles. Now, I've got an example of a pine right here, and you can see the needles, and I'm just going to pull on it right here. I'm pulling on it, and you'll notice, oops, actually, this particular one, let's see if I did that right. Yeah, this is actually, well, no, I didn't pull it right. Here it is. You'll notice that, can you see how these 2 needles are joined together? So this is a fascicle with 2 needles. Now, in fact, in the lab in the back, I put many species of pine trees, and you will see some have 3 needles in each fascicle, some have 2 needles, some have 5 needles, so they vary. And in fact, part of the way we classify these cone-bearing trees, these conifers or gymnosperms, is in part they're classified based on the number of needles per fascicle, per bundle. So you should know that. All right, now, now that we've explained that, which you should know, what a fascicle is, the only other thing that I want you to know is that there are male cones and female cones. Now, everybody knows about female cones. The female cones start out small, and they grow larger. This is a typical cone. Here's another one. And this one's really heavy, and it's got these really sharp spines. These are female cones. And what develops inside the female cone are, there are little eggs or macrogametes that can be fertilized, and when they're fertilized, they become a little embryo. What do we call these little embryo? You know them as pine nuts. Ever had pine nuts on a salad? All right. A seed is a baby plant. So that's what develops in here. Now, what you might not know is there are male cones. They look like this. And they are typically found in clusters. Because they're so small, people don't notice them, right? And it's kind of covered in part by all these needles. And since you didn't know about them, you weren't noticing them. They actually, if we shake them, they have all this yellow pollen on them. So they are found in clusters. So those are called male cones. You have pictures of this on page L13. Thank you. I'm getting too many plant specimens here. So on L13, on the top left, this shows on L13, this shows some small female cones, and they get larger. And inside the female cone are eggs, or what we call macrogametes, large sex cells. All right, so those are the female cones. Those you're familiar with. Down here on the lower left, this shows a cluster of male cones. The male cones are much smaller than the female cones. They're typically in a cluster containing many of them, and they are covered with yellow pollen. What is pollen? Pollen is really like sperm, but it doesn't have a flagellum or tail. And the pollen is really like sperm. It's called the microgametes, the small sex cells. Now, the way that the pollen is dispersed is by the wind. So every time it's windy, it blows the pollen into the air. Now, of course, some people have allergies to pollen, and they start sneezing. But there's nothing intrinsically harmful about the pollen. Now, what happens is this pollen, containing the microgametes, which are like sperm, they can stick to the female cone. And when they stick to the female cone, it actually, the microgamete goes into the female cone and unites with the macrogametes, the eggs, inside the female cone. This is very similar to, in humans, a male sperm, sperm from a guy, unites with an egg in the woman, and that forms a baby. In this case, this is going to form a baby plant called a pine nut. A pine nut, a seed. And so that's what's inside the female cone. Now, how are these seeds, these pine nuts, released? They're released in one of two ways. The cone opens up, just like you see here, and one of two things happens. Either the little pine nuts or seeds fall out of the female cone onto the ground, or the entire female cone drops onto the ground, rolls, and disperses the seeds. All right? So this is how pine trees do it. So here's what we wrote back on page L12. On L12, we wrote that conifers have both small male cones that produce pollen grains containing the male microgamete and larger female cones that produce the ova, the eggs, the macrogametes. The pollen grains of the male cone are dispersed by the wind. We call that wind pollinated. And after the pollen grains fertilize, that means unite with the ova, the eggs of the female cones, the fertilized ova or zygote develop into seeds. Right? So those we call these seeds, we call pine nuts. And people put them on salads even. All right, so let's summarize what I wanted you to know about phylum Gymnosperm. So on class Gymnosperm. These are phylum Tracheophyta, class Gymnosperm. There are three things basically. The needles are grouped into bundles called fascicles, and in fact, that's in part how we classify them. The male cones are these little cones found in clusters that release pollen into the air. And there are the larger female cones containing the macrogametes, the eggs. And so when the pollen unites with the eggs inside the female cones, we get a baby plant or seed. All right, so much for that. So that takes us to the last class in the plant kingdom. All right, so this isn't going on forever. Okay, so that takes us to page L14. I'll come back to this picture in just a moment. On L14, so the last class, this is the most important class in the most important phylum of the plant kingdom. So in the plant kingdom, the most important phylum is the vascular plants, or tracheophytes, phylum Tracheophyta. And of the three classes of tracheophytes that we asked you to know, ferns, gymnosperms, the pine-bearing trees with pine cones and needle-shaped leaves, the most important is the angiosperms. Those plants and trees, vascular plants and trees that have flowers. There are 250,000 species. And let's see, how many should we make you learn? 250,000. Let's learn 3,000. That's not too many. No, we're just going to mention a few examples. So I think you can start to understand why biologists specialize. Because a biologist who was going to study plants, and anybody know what we call biologists who study plants? Botanists. Because that's such a huge field into itself that that's enough to master. You spend your entire life understanding and mastering to forget about worrying about all the animals. Incidentally, there's even more animals than there are plants. There's 250,000 species of plants. There's 1.5 million species of animals. So in the animal kingdom, the zoologists even subspecialize because these are so huge. Obviously, there are other biologists who just focus on bacteria. They're called bacteriologists. And there's other biologists who just specialize on fungi. They're called mycologists. So there's just all these subspecialties because biology is so huge and there's so much to understand about the world. Now, they're characterized, flowering plants and trees, by having flowers. Not all flowers, as we're going to see, are beautiful, like roses with like rose flowers or like orchids, not all flowering plants have beautiful flowers. We're going to be learning these are flowers. You know, Mother's Day will be coming up soon. I brought you some flowers. All right, so not all flowers are beautiful. We're going to be learning that it's when you see the flower, you immediately know whether it's wind-pollinated or insect-pollinated. Because this, it has to be wind-pollinated. This would not attract an insect's attention, but this would. Okay, it has colors and it has smells. And not only do we like that, so do some insects. So those are insect pollinated when they have beautiful flowers. Anyhow, we're going to divide, because there's 250,000 species of flowering plants and trees, we're going to divide this class of angiosperms into two subclasses, the dicotyledon, or dicot for short, and the monocotyledon, or monocot angiosperms. Let's first of all, at the bottom paragraph, tell you who are the monocot. Let's start with the monocots. Who are they? The monocot angiosperms, of which there are 50,000 species, are grasses, or grass-like plants. And our first thought is, boy, is that boring. Well, maybe, but this is the most important subclass of the angiosperms. And if you're wondering, why would grasses be important? Because that's what grains are. Grains are grasses. So that includes wheat, rice, oats, rye, and corn. Now, of course, there's other grasses. There's grasses that grow on your lawn, right? Those are grasses. And it also includes other grass-like plants, including not only irises, and tulips, and orchids, but also asparagus and philodendrons, onions, bulrushes, bamboo, sugarcane, and banana trees and palm trees, which are not real trees, as we had once mentioned before. They are overgrown grasses. So really all you have to do in terms of remembering the monocots is they are grasses or grass-like plants. They are the most important because they include the grains. Without them, just imagine a world without corn, right? That means no corn tortillas also. Imagine a world without any barley, no barley. That means no beer. Imagine no oats, no oatmeal, no rice, all right? No sushi, at least with rice in it. And most importantly of all, no wheat. That means no bread, no pasta, right? No pizza dough, donuts. What's the point of living? So no cakes, no cookies. So these really are called the staples of life. Bread is the staple of life. These cookies and bread and cakes and rice and so on and corn. And obviously in some parts of the world, like in Asia, they rely on rice. In Europe and here, wheat. In Mexico, obviously, Central America, corn. But these are the very, very important plants. Now, if you can remember that the monocots are the grasses or grass-like plants, including these overgrown grasses like banana trees and palm trees, remember, they don't have any branches. They don't look like regular trees with branches. Then what are the dicots? The dicots are all the other flowering plants and trees, other than the grasses. So these, there are 200,000 species of them, and these include, I'll clear my throat, they include peas, beans, lupins, roses, strawberries, radishes, broccoli, hibiscus, tomatoes, potatoes, eggplant, tobacco, spearmint, carrots, celery, parsley, sunflowers, zinnias, lettuce, pansies, carnation, and apple trees, oak trees, maple trees, willow trees, walnut trees, acacia trees, eucalyptus trees, and that's just the beginning. So in other words, if you can remember the monocots or the grasses, the grains, then all the other flowering plants, all the other really flowering plants and trees, the dominant things that live on land that you're familiar with are dicots. Now, there are four major differences between monocots and dicots, and they're pictured right here. And the first difference I want to mention is the seed itself, because that's how it gets its name, monocot and dicot. An example of a monocot, we said, is a corn. When you look at a corn seed, it's like a little corn kernel, isn't it? And if you try to peel off like the outer skin, That's all there is. It's one piece to that seed, monocot. Now, an example of a dicot would be a lima bean. So I think everybody knows with a lima bean or a pea, if you remove that outer skin, there's two halves to it. Everybody know what I'm talking about? So that's why it's called a dicot. So the seeds are different in that respect. The seeds of the monocots, the grains, are one piece. The dicots, which are all the others, are two parts to it. Another difference is how the vessels are arranged, the phloem and xylem vessels. In the monocots, all the vessels are in parallel or straight lines. So here's a nice example of a monocot leaf. I don't know if you can make this out, but you'll certainly see it out in the lab. And all the vessels are in straight lines. I kind of make that out. On the other hand, the dicot leaves look like this. They're branched. And it's got one that's not so diseased. All right. So in other words, this is classic dicot. See how it's branched or netted venation. All right. And a rose. The leaves of roses look like that. So that's a second difference. A third difference is the stems and trunks. When we look at the dicot trunk of a tree or the stems, the vessels are arranged into rings. And I'm looking to see where I'll find it later, but we've got a section through the trunk of a dicot tree, like an oak tree, and I think everybody is familiar with the idea that you can see the rings in the trunk or in the stems. In the case of the monocot, the vessels are scattered. There are no rings. So what's an example of a tree that's a monocot tree? A palm tree. Palm trees don't show rings. All right? They're not like an oak tree that has rings. So the vessels are arranged differently between a monocot, like a palm tree, and a dicot, like an oak tree. And the last difference, the fourth difference, is the parts of the flower. When we look at the parts of a monocot flower, all the parts are in threes, or multiples of three. All right, so here is, this is a type of orchid. It's called a Cymbidium. And I don't know how well you can see this, but there are what we would, as you initially look at this, we're going to learn more about this later yet today, you would say there's 6 petals. 6 is a multiple of 3. So all the monocots will have flower parts in threes. Could be 3 or 6 or 9 or 12 or 15, but it's always a multiple of 3. Everything about it is in threes. On the other hand, the dicots, the flower parts are in 4s or 5s. If you were to look at and count the number of petals of a rose, everything about a rose is a multiple of 5. It's either a multiple of 5 or a multiple of 4. Here's another flower. You can easily see this one. I'll put it right here. You make that out? That's 5. Should have a dark background, but this is a multiple of 5. I think you can make that out. I can't see the 5. All right, so that's if it's either a multiple of 4 or 5, it's a dicot. So we're starting to understand the differences between monocots and dicots. Let me summarize these 4 differences. I don't know if there's any need for you to write it down, again, because you've got it right there. But I said I would return back to this chart. So here's on the chart, on the angiosperm. So what is it that we really want you to know? These are the flowering plants and trees. We divided them into 2 subclasses. Monocots, which are the grasses and grains, and the dicots, which are everything else. All right, so what are the 4 characteristics of monocots? They have vessels in their leaves. They're in a straight line. In dicots, the vessels are branched. In the trunk and in the stems, in the monocot, the vessels are scattered. In the dicot, their vessels are arranged into rings. In the seed, the monocots are just one seed, one part to the seed. Mono means one. In the dicots, Like a bean, a lima bean, it's in twos. Di means two. And finally, the flower parts of monocots are in threes or multiples of three, whereas in dicots it's fours or fives. Obviously, if you could just remember that monocots are threes, any pattern other than three is a dicot. Right? You don't have to go and memorize them both. If you remember one of them, if you count the number of flower parts and it's not three or a multiple of three, then it's a dicot. I know somebody's going to say, what if there's 12? Is that divisible by 3 or 4? Okay, obviously, don't worry about it. I'm not going to give you one that's like that. Okay? But if it's a 5 or 25, those are not divisible by 3. Fair to say. All right, so, now, let's look at one more picture here on page L15. So on L15, this is just showing, again, pictures contrasting, comparing a monocot with a dicot plant. So we can see at the top, this is actually showing a corn plant and a bean plant, lima bean. So here's corn and here's a lima bean. Now, if you're not really clear on corn and lima beans, you can either go to the market and buy a package of frozen corn and frozen lima beans. To save money, you could buy a package of frozen succotash. Has anybody ever heard of succotash? Who's heard of the word succotash? All right, is it sold in the market? The answer is yes. What is succotash? Lima beans and corn. Okay, they sell it, you know, Bird's Eye or whatever. They sell packages of combination of lima beans and corn, or peas and corn, and that's commonly called succotash. You don't have to know that, but just thought I'd mention it. Now, so you'll notice the one kernel to the corn and 2 dicot for the lima bean, vessels in straight lines for the corn plant, branched vessels for the dicot. And we talked about some of the other differences. On page L16, a few other terms here that we'll just mention briefly about plants. So something that's called a tree has typically a large trunk that we call a tree, but it's usually branching. Shrubs are woody plants, but they're much smaller. They don't have one large trunk. And herbs are plants that don't have any wood to them at all. Right? So they're called herbs. What's an annual? An annual is a plant that lives 1 year and then dies. You'd say, really? There are plants that live 1 year? Anybody ever plant tomatoes? Yeah. Don't you have to keep planting them every year? Oh. Well, if they drop seeds, they might have created new plants, but they live, they produce seeds, and then they die. Okay, it's not. Now, how about a rose? No, that rose bush is there year after year after year. And then you've got some plants or trees like redwoods that live for 1,000 years. Right? So, but we've got annuals. Most of the common flowers that people plant, you know, you put seeds or you buy a little potted plant and it dies and you have to plant it again. Carnations, impatiens. Anybody know what impatiens are? Johnny jump-ups, they call them. Pansies. Anybody ever plant pansies? All right, anyhow. So those are annuals. Perennials are those that live year after year. Corn, you have to plant corn every year, or wheat. All right, the evergreen, it means that they always have leaves all year round. They may drop some, but they always have leaves. Deciduous means they shed them. They drop the leaves. And succulents have these fleshy stems, like a cactus or a jade plant or an ice plant. They're big, thick leaves and stems.